All right, get fired up. It's a privilege to be here. I'm so excited. I, like you, am a fellow business owner in an interesting world that we live in. We're learning from one another, but it's so exciting and inspiring just to hear some stories, to sit with Jim Blanchard and hear some of your stories. And what an amazing organization you guys have. I know you're only a day in, you have a few days ahead, but buckle up. The next few speakers, the next couple of days are going to be amazing as well. So thanks for your time. Quick snapshot of my family. This is my beautiful wife, Lindy. We've been married 20 years this summer. Our 4 kids, like Robin said, 2 girls and 2 boys. And let me just say, we're going to do something that needs to be done more often, okay? If your spouse is here, spouses, stay seated. Can we give a standing ovation for our spouses? Come on, let's give it up for them. Come on. There we go. You don't hear enough spouses. I don't know if you were drug here or you just you wanted to come or needed a day or so at the beach, but you are our support, our encouragement, and the fuel. And we are so glad that you have done all that you've done to encourage your spouse, and the Lord has used you greatly in our life. So life is busy. I have to leave early in the morning because we have baseball games tomorrow afternoon and all kinds of volleyball games and all kinds of stuff. But I want to talk about tonight a few things. C.S. Lewis says people need to be reminded more often than instructed. So I'm going to remind us of a few principles you've probably heard in the context of my story, especially the last few years. That was quite challenging. Hopefully you'll relate to parts of it and will walk away more encouraged in the work that the Lord is doing in and through for-profit business leaders in this season and for His glory. There's a word that I'm going to start with that maybe you've never heard before. It's a Hebrew word, and I think it's going to be the focal point of what we talk about. And hopefully it will be a paradigm-shifting word that maybe you've gone down this path in your organization, maybe you just need the reminder, or maybe it totally shifts the way you think about the business and the organization that you are called to steward. So before I do that, let me just say a quick prayer, and we'll get going for the night. Father, thanks for this opportunity. Thank you to these amazing business leaders, their spouses, their families. If they left behind kids and team members, I pray that you'd watch over them. In the next few minutes, I pray that the road you've led all of us on, you've led me on the past season, would encourage and challenge everyone here for your glory ultimately. Allow us to rethink and reimagine what true, virtuous vocation and calling looks like. In your name, amen. So I was a religion major who went to seminary. I ended up downshifting my MDiv to a master's of theology because I did not want to take Hebrew. I don't know if anybody's been to seminary or taken Hebrew. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but the one word I want to talk about briefly is avodah. Has anybody seen this word or heard of this word? This is an amazing word. This is a paradigm-shifting, world-changing, business-changing word. The first of many times it's used in the Old Testament is Genesis 2:15. The Lord put man in the garden to work it and to keep it. This word work, avodah, is used in this context, and it's also used throughout the Old Testament in a different context in our modern mind, and it's used as the word worship. In the Old Testament, service of others, worship, cultivation, and work was the same word. The idea that our work can be worship. The idea that the Lord put man in the garden, this garden city that did exist, 4-part gospel, and will exist one day again. And pre-fall, man's job was to cultivate, to work the garden. And in doing so, this was his worship. The idea that work every single day can be an act of worship is something that I think is starting, thanks to you, starting to trickle down to my generation and to the next generation. Work is worship. If it's done for the right reason, for the gospel, and for the right purpose. The idea of work, worship, and cultivation. Are we cultivating the workplace in which we've been given? I wish I had this perspective 25 years ago. I had to discover this by learning from mentors and by really struggling through understanding what I thought was a dichotomy between ministry and business. Now I understand what Jesus' prayer meant on earth as in heaven. My morning meeting in Atlanta, your meeting on Thursday, your Zoom call, looking over the balance sheet, your hiring, bringing heaven to earth is our way to work and worship at the same time. Avodah, the idea that work, worship, and cultivating the garden of our place of worship, which often for us is our place of work. Our business is a garden the Lord has given us to till the soil, to water it, to pull out the thorns and thistles, to make it a place where the Lord can give the sunlight and the nourishments for human flourishing and ultimately his glory to grow. So think about our businesses that we're stewarding in this season as a garden that needs cultivating, and as we work it, we are worshiping the Lord on earth as in heaven. So my theology growing up in a wonderful, sweet Southern Baptist church, maybe you relate to this, there were a few levels of the Lord's hierarchy kind of on this scheme. There was, I don't know if it was when the Lottie Moon offering was passed or a missionary would come and share, but there was the 1040 missionary. That was number one. That guy was amazing, 1040 missionary. Then there were maybe missionaries to Europe. You can visit Paris, so it's not quite as tough. And then there were head pastors. Then there was the worship pastor. Somewhere down here was the youth pastor. He had a little too much fun, right? And then there were the nonprofit leaders. Then there's a whole nother category of the business people. And their job was to make the money and then throw it over into this pile. And maybe the extent of, at least again, this was my theology growing up, and maybe it was yours too, maybe the extent of our worship and our ministry was to make the money to give it to the actual ministers. And I still hear these terms being used. Are you in ministry? Who's in ministry? They left the ministry. If we're believers, we're all called to ministry. One of the most significant things we can do for the next generation to finally end this paradigm is just to change our language. We're all in ministry. What is the land that we're called to cultivate? Is it a church? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a for-profit business? Avodah, we're going to work, cultivate, worship, and serve others through whatever God has called us uniquely to do. There's no hierarchy of ministry and business. So I was a religion major at Sanford that started a couple of businesses in college, one of which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then I went to seminary. And then, man, I struggled back and forth for years. I wanted to change the world, so I had to go to ministry. But I was entrepreneurial. I got it. I'm going to start a church. Because if I start a church, I get to scratch the entrepreneurial itch. But at the same time, I'm still in ministry. That way I can glorify God the most. Does anybody feel or had felt or maybe still feels this tension? But man, it took me reading through Scripture, reading lots and lots of commentaries about what work and worship was, and then following around a couple Christian for-profit business leaders, specifically Dan Cathy in Atlanta for a couple years, and watching the excellence, the unapologetic for-profit growth nature, and the opportunity he and others had to work and worship at the same time. Doing both. There's a fantastic quote. If you have your phone, please take a screenshot of this. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. A.W. Tozer, "Let every man abide in the calling wherein he is called, and his work will be as sacred as the work of the ministry. It's not what a man does that determines whether his work is sacred or secular. It is why he does it." Let every man abide in the calling in which he is called. His work will be as sacred as the work of the ministry. It's not what a man does that determines whether his work is sacred or secular. It's why he does it. There was a cobbler that went to Martin Luther that just became a believer back in the 1500s. Martin Luther, I just became a Christian. I've given my life to Christ. What should I do now? And his inference was, should I become a monk? Should I go to a monastery? Should I join the ministry? Luther said, what do you do now? I'm a cobbler. I make shoes. Great. Make a good shoe. Make an excellent shoe. Sell it at a fair price. That's the work of ministry. That's Avodah, working as worship, cultivating the cobbler store, cultivating the field, cultivating the law firm, cultivating whatever your business is, working and worshiping at the same time. So a little bit of my story to lead up to the last couple years. This was me 20 years ago this past April on the top of a pickup truck in Birmingham, Alabama, hosting the first ever fun run. Has anybody ever given to a local elementary school? A kid, a grandkid? There's a good chance it was through one of our Boosterthon fun run programs. This was the moment it first began. Note my incredibly robust speaker system, which was a Rocky soundtrack on top of my Chevy truck. I got a very quick video, if you're not familiar with what we do, a quick video of our program today and our way to worship as we work while serving about 6,000 elementary schools across the country. So early on, I pictured in that tension that I would climb a mountain, that I'd one day be 90 years old, I'd get to the top of the mountain, and I would have made a mistake. Again, this is bad theology growing up. I would have regret. I either carried the world change mission ministry flag to the top of the mountain, that was my life legacy, and I looked back and saw the entrepreneurial gifts, or I carried the entrepreneurial gifts to the top of the mountain, grew a business, started something, got to sell, relationships, people, but man, did I miss God's calling. Again, this is when my thinking was a dichotomy, that work and worship were separate. I've since realized that climbing the mountain, the Lord gives us the opportunity to do work as worship. Both flags, your business, your ministry, truly one flag together ultimately for His glory. So I've been through all the ups and downs of businesses that you guys have been through, the startup stages literally in my basement, traveling the country with just my wife as she's pregnant, living on people's couches, then the fun scale phase when everything becomes fun, it's just all about selling. Then I realized, of course, everybody I hired is just like me. This is super fun and terribly inefficient. I need some operators. I need people to help me systematize and organize and keep up with stuff, right? All these ups and downs, then challenges and challenges. And then finally, a highlight moment for me. We're almost 20 years old as a company. We're kicking off a new season of Booster. We scaled across the country. We're celebrating, and I'm going to invite and surprise my company with a guest appearance of my childhood hero, Braves right-handed pitcher, Hall of Famer John Smoltz. So he comes to the Braves Stadium. We exchange jerseys. This is super cool. John spoke about the importance of courage and grit. We had just finished a season where we updated our company values. This is another talk for another day. And we call them virtues. Something that's more aspirational, more actionable, more timeless, more not just something that's professional, but that could bleed into all the personal aspects of our lives. So business was growing like crazy. We just served schools in every state. We had about 700 team members. I'm in the Brave Stadium with my childhood hero, and he's talking about courage and grit, and things are going crazy. And then, February 27th, 2020, I'm watching the TV, and the country of Japan, the first country in the world to close every elementary school. So I called my CFO and said, this is a crazy scenario. I'm an Enneagram 7. I'm an ENFP. I don't think about bad scenarios. I only think about optimistic, fun, future stuff. But you're the Enneagram 6, and it's your job to think of these scenarios. So draw me up a scenario if, I know it's nuts, if what happened in Japan, because of this thing they're talking about, this virus over there in Asia, if that happens to happen in America, what would happen? He's like, listen, that's ridiculous. We've spent the last 5 years diversifying. We're in all 50 states. We have different service levels. There's no way in the world America would close every elementary school. It might happen in a state, in a city, might delay some programs. Let's just draw it up and see. Well, March the 13th, 2020, you remember where you were probably if you were running a business at the time. It's kind of like the 9/11 of the last few years. We're watching the TV, the NBA had just closed. All of a sudden, the new phrase, 2 weeks to slow the curve. 2 weeks. Stan, glad we built that worst case scenario. We need to break the glass and crack it because it looks like for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be sitting around. And that kind of stinks because this is like in the heart of our season. We're raising schools money and we're projecting at least $2 million a week in revenue. So we built some scenarios. Good, better, best. No, we built average, bad, worst. And 2 weeks became 2 months. It became a month, and then a month became 2 months, and then it became the entire semester. 4 different times, our worst case scenario became our best case scenario. So 12 weeks, 0 school programs, and $17 million of expected revenue later, we're sitting here in May thinking, man, we survived it. That was incredibly rough, but I think we'll be okay in the fall when the fall rolls around. Because surely, 2 weeks to 2 months to an entire semester. In fact, my CFO, Stan, called me. This is why I wanted to give a rounding applause to the spouses. And he said, Chris, no one's going to tell you this. It's my job to tell you. Everyone's working for you. This is April the 15th. I'm about to turn 40. We have big plans for the future, and we're going to celebrate the summer. And hey, look, this semester's not turning out like you think, but there's $12 million in the bank, and it looks like schools are going to be closed. You could take some of it, most of it, part of it's yours. You own 100% of the company. You could just wait a year or two. You could restart this thing. I want to give you the option that you could walk away and pause and try to resurrect it or start it again. You did it once. Maybe you could do it again. You just need to hear that's an option because no one else is telling you that because they're wanting their paycheck while we're waiting this thing out. I said, only because, Stan, I respect you greatly. I'm gonna bring it to my wife, and we're going to pray about it. But I think I know what she's going to say. Lindy, I just want to talk about this over the weekend. We just spent a couple days in prayer about this. This is what Stan suggested. Turning 40 in a couple weeks, And Lindy immediately said, absolutely not. This is not what God has called us to do. He's called us to work as worship, to start this thing, to serve schools, to inspire students, to inspire healthy fitness and character lessons all over the country. And I feel like God is going to use this, hated the word at the time, to prune the organization and to prune you so you and the organization can grow more in the future. The Lord prunes whom he loves, as painful as might be. So, okay, let's do it. So the month went on of April and of May and of June. We thought the fall was going to be okay. Lindy could sense, because I got a phone call from a very red state conservative general manager that said, got some bad news. They're delaying school. We're hearing the word virtual again. It looks like the fall of 2020 is going to be pretty bad as well. So she knew after about 4 months of this. By the way, we were over 500, so we were too big to get PPP and too small to get a bailout. And we were burning $100,000 a day. We ultimately, I'll show you a chart in a second, went 173 days with no revenue. So Lindy knew you need a day to get away and to hear from the Lord, to pray for clarity, So we drove from our house in Atlanta up to Highlands, North Carolina, and we stood on top of a mountain called Whiteside. Has never been to Highlands, North Carolina, Whiteside Mountains? Beautiful view. It's always gorgeous. You could see for miles. You could see the Clemson football lights 60 miles away. This was my view from Whiteside Mountain. I'm praying for clarity. And in all of life, this is what I felt like. This is what I saw. I'm praying for clarity. And in all of life, this is what I felt like. This is what I saw. I had two prayers, by the way, before 40th and right the month before COVID. Lord, I feel a calling. I want you to multiply our culture. I love our culture. Our culture is our people. It's exciting. People love coming to work. Work as worship, cultivation. Multiply our culture. And I've heard too many stories of young leaders, when the organization becomes successful, they lose the humility the work ethic, the community, and the dependence on the Lord that got them there. So Lord, multiply our culture and keep me dependent on you. These were my pre-COVID prayers. Now I saw the Lord answer them by, unfortunately, as the summer went on, though we did get a little bit of clarity that day. And in this moment, I felt a little bit of peace knowing there is a future. There are mountains out there. Even if I can't see them, there are mountains on the horizon. God, at times, veils with a fog so thick you can't see the mountains in order to prune so that one day he can grow. So here we are praying and hoping, thinking, okay, this is going to be bad, but not fully understanding how bad. Then the call comes from my general manager saying, hey, the fall is going to be terrible. Prior to COVID, we were planning on just the fall semester. It was going to be a $50 million revenue semester. Fast forward 120 days, we were praying, literally on our knees, prayer walks around the building every day for a $5 million semester. Our mantra was 5 to survive. I mean, this was it. We went for it. We felt the Lord say go for it. We were running out of cash quickly. 50 million was the pre-COVID expectation, 5 million afterwards. Had just a glimpse. So we go back to the house after this. This is a moment I'll never forget. And my wife says, what is the word picture you're living in right now? What do you see? And I said, honestly, it's a storm. It's a hurricane. Unfortunately, one's on the horizon now. It just feels like a storm. I can't see my way out of it. I can't get my way out of it. I can't fight my way out of it. It just keeps coming. It just keeps getting worse. And her question number 2 was, where do you see yourself in the hurricane? And I said, I'm holding the boat of 840 team members, and the storm keeps getting worse, and I just can't hold it anymore. I feel like I'm about to drown. And she said, that's the problem. You're viewing yourself as the one holding the boat. The Lord is holding the boat for you. You're in the boat. He's the captain. He's even the captain of the storm. One day, there will be smooth sailing again, but you're viewing yourself, probably like many of us, as a type A, responsible leader that wants to help and serve their people. But I was putting myself in a place that was only reserved for the Lord. That I was going to be the one that held up the boat or captained the boat. In fact, the Lord is captaining the ship, and I'm in it. If I can only trust that his pruning will one day lead to flourishing and growth. So a snapshot of that season, we came back, we realized what we had to do in order to save the company was by far the most painful, challenging decision and season and week of our life. Revenue was expected up here and then it fell, and this was the worst of it. We finally said, if we're going to survive, we can't have a company of 840 people. We had to cut 85% of our workforce. And for me, a culture guy who personally hired and married, officiated weddings for some, and would send texts and friendships and was at their weddings and saw their kids and shipped, congratulations notes and cards and flowers. Like, these were my family members. But I had to remember that my 2 prayers prior to COVID was the Lord would multiply our culture. And unfortunately, though this was not the way I wanted it to happen, this was the beginning of the Lord sending out 700 amazing, amazing leaders that I wouldn't for a few months, but now I look back and see the incredible jobs, the cultures that they're changing, and the worlds that they are multiplying. The Lord also has a sense of humor, and before the foundations of the world, but known to me about 6 months prior, a friend of mine called and said, hey, sometime this summer, July the 25th, 2020, we need to film something at your house. Okay, great. Well, I forgot all about it. In the midst of all this chaos that was going on, about a week beforehand, hey, we're filming at your house, music video, it's going to be great, filming, great. Okay, sounds good. Do whatever you need to do. I'm going to be at work the day that I'm laying off 85% of our team members, 700 team members, furloughing them. I love you, but we're running out of money. I'm praying for you. Terrible, terrible day. What happens to be happening at my house, I forget about all this. I'm at the office, I call my wife, she's like, you didn't really tell me that this music video that's happened to being filmed, I knew there was something going on. I didn't really know what it was about. It happened to be Lecrae and Mineo filming a music video. You're going to have to YouTube this before you go to bed tonight, called Celebrate More. The name of the video is about celebration, one of our company's virtues. So the Lord knew in the middle of this just craziest, worst day, worst moment season that there would be at my house a music video being filmed by these Christian artists called Celebrate More. So in that moment when I come home, like, let me just see what's going on, I'm reminded that even in the toughest moments, when the Lord is pruning, when the fog is in front of our face and we can't even see it, there's still mountains out there, and the Lord still wants us to celebrate his goodness. So the Lord's sprinkling in all of these little small things throughout this really challenging time. Best case scenario became our worst case scenario 4 different times. Doing all we could to preserve payroll. Finally, watching the fog being lifted, understanding that the Lord's plan is greater than mine, that there are mountains on the horizon, and then understanding that I see myself now in the boat being led by Christ as opposed to being the captain of the boat. So think about that for you for just a minute. As we're called to steward our businesses, not just own, where do you see yourself in the story that's going on in your life right now? Is it a storm? Is it a mountaintop? Is it a fog? Do you see yourself in the boat? Or do you see yourself holding the boat that is a weight that's just too much to bear, that's only a weight for the Lord ultimately to carry? So finally, we get through this season. We ended up going 173 days of no revenue. We were down to our last $500,000 going into the fall. By God's grace, instead of $5 million in revenue, we had $10 million in revenue. We finish the fall. We get to February the next year of 21, and we get a call from our accountant that says there's this really weird clause that just got added to PPP version 2, revision 3, and guess what? You're about to get some PPP money that we viewed as God's growth capital. So the Lord took us through the whole pruning process to be dependent on him. And then once it was over, gave us some growth capital that we've since used to grow the organization, acquire our first company a few weeks ago that expands us now into the middle school and high school markets. We can impact more students, more faculty, and more staff. And we just 3 days ago moved into our first actual building as a company. We've been leasing the whole time. One more final story. We've been leasing for the past 17 years after we moved out of my basement. We found this amazing property. It wasn't for sale. Did some prayer walks around it. We made an offer. They accepted the offer. This was back when interest rates were about a third of what they are right now, about a week before the first rate hike. It was way too big. It was a 60,000 square foot office building. We only needed about 25,000. We just felt like the Lord wanted us to have it. What the Lord then put in our hearts was, wait a minute. You want to multiply culture. We have lots of friends and relationships in Atlanta, a lot of startups doing amazing things that want to be around other people and part of a community. So we said, this is it. Let's start a group of entrepreneurs, kind of like a co-working space, but let's hand select the Christian business owners that want to transform the city, industry agnostic, whatever they're doing. Let's invite them into a community, and we've since called this community Virtue Village. The idea that Avada, that work is worship. Let's form micro communities, optional at lunchtime, that you can join to grow further, to challenge one another, and to encourage each other to grow in your faith and in your vocation. The idea that this is a garden, let's create a building that's a garden, let's invite other organizations into it. So what do we do with the growth capital? Acquired a company, grew as an organization, and then used it to create a space, an environment, a garden for others to flourish. Ultimately, on earth as in heaven. So let me go back to a quick summary right where I started. Number 1, the Lord is the captain of the ship. He drives it, he captains it, he invites us to go along for the ride. The valleys, the hard times, the challenges are pruning for our good and for his glory. If you're in it now or if you're going to go in it, view the challenge as a pruning that the Lord will grow over time when he chooses to lift the fog. A reminder to be generous with others, that the Lord will impact and multiply your culture at his time of his choosing. And as Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. May we build redemptive cultures where our team members, believers or not, can see that we are working as we're worshiping, as we're cultivating an environment for human flourishing and for the Lord's glory. That we have, because he's given, our businesses as tools in his hands. Let me say a quick prayer for all of us. Father, thanks for these amazing organizations, who they are, who they represent. Thank you for the challenging part of the last couple years. Thank you for allowing my prayers to be answered by you, that we would be dependent on you, that you multiply our culture. And I pray that for every business owner in the room, that they would be dependent upon you, that you'd multiply their culture, all the good of their culture. I also pray that you would pluck out from the soil the thorns and thistles of their culture. I pray that they would cultivate the relationships, the business opportunities, and the work in front of them. I pray that the word avodah, work as worship, as cultivation, would constantly be on our hearts and minds. In Jesus' name, amen. A couple table discussions just for the next couple minutes for y'all to discuss. Number one, what can I do to move my business in a more redemptive direction? What's the one specific practical thing you could do for your business to take a step towards a redemptive environment? Number two, what part of my culture is the most redemptive, and how can I multiply it? Maybe inside your organization or to other organizations. And then finally, who can I invest my life in by mentoring? Let me just talk for 30 seconds about this word that seems to be misinterpreted by every generation. Sometimes everyone says, I want a mentor. I want to mentor. I would like a mentor. I like a mentee. But sometimes we over-define this word as discipleship every single day or once a week or some amount of hours that's just ultimately unobtainable. I think if the next generation could view mentors as having a host of mentors, not one singular hero person that answers every question, but someone they could go to for specific areas of life, a marriage mentor, maybe a parenting mentor, finance and marketing, a business growth, strategy, leadership, culture. Defining mentorship as a host of mentors, not just one hero. And mentorship could literally mean a coffee twice a year, and then the opportunity to have access to them for phone calls, not necessarily discipleship. I feel like if we could break down that paradigm of mentorship, that it's access to each other's lives and across all categories, I think every generation would win from that relationship. So think through that question as well. Who could I invest my life in by mentoring? 2 coffees a year, access to your life to make an impact on their life like many of y'all have made on mine. Let's discuss these. Thank you guys for your time. God bless you.